to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivanna and Sam.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Transformation in Trials podcast. We are delighted today to be joined by our next guest, which is Andy Yates. And Andy is Chief Scientific Officer at a company called Artelo Biosciences. Hi, Andy. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Sam. Thanks very much for inviting me onto the podcast. Looking forward to it.
No problem at all. So as we know, with Transformation in Trials, we try to dive into everything that is going on from a transformational standpoint in clinical research and clinical trials. Andy, we're going to dive into a bit about you and your background as we get into the podcast. But maybe you could start us off with a little bit of background about Artelo Biosciences and the type of research that Artelo are focused in on.
Okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. So Artelo Biosciences was formed 5 years ago with the concept that the endocannabinoid system, which we can talk about later, but that's the wording we use. But where some of the viewers will probably recognize cannabis-based medicines, was starting to become a very exciting area. And Artelo Biosciences wanted to capture that excitement and energy, but take it in a slightly different direction from where the majority of players were doing at that point, which was to sort of move away from the plant as such as the single source of the cannabinoid medicines, learn from the plant, but go forward with optimized medicines that can really target the endocannabinoid system. And ultimately, because endocannabinoids are substances called lipids, the lipid modification within the body. And that's really the whole premise of what we've done. And within 5 years, we've become listed on the NASDAQ. So we're a NASDAQ listed company. And we have 3 programs within our portfolio, each one of them very exciting in their own way, each one of them modifying endocannabinoids and lipids in their own particular way and mechanism of action. So that in a nutshell is Artelo Biosciences, and where we're directing all of that, where we think extremely valuable and untapped energy from the endocannabinoid system is into true unmet need with patients, obviously with chemo-induced peripheral neuropathy, post-traumatic stress disorders, cancer-induced anorexia, which is in itself a very devastating disease. And I'm sure we'll deep dive into some of them as we go through the podcast.
Perfect. No, thanks for that introduction, Andy. It's really fascinating area of research to be in. And I think what piques my attention often is the whole cannabinoid research. And I think rightly or wrongly, there seems to be a stigma attached perhaps to this particular space. Can you talk to us a bit about that and how you face that head on and still kind of set Artelo Biosciences up for success potentially when there could be a stigma, if there is a stigma attached to this at all? Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've captured it nicely in some respects, and that certainly was the status quo probably 10, 15 years ago. So that was when I actually did some of my PhD research. It's perhaps a little longer than that, actually. But when I originally did my PhD research into the endocannabinoid system and some of the discoveries that we wanted to try and do there with separating out the effects in the body versus the effects in the brain, I think cannabis medicine and cannabis was stigmatized. In fact, when I was a pharmacist under training, we learned about cannabis under the section titled Drugs of Abuse. Wow, we've moved a long way since then. I mean, obviously, from a recreational perspective, it's still outlawed and banned in many jurisdictions, or if it's not, sometimes the law is unclear. But we're not talking about that, and I don't want to really get into that debate about recreational cannabis, because that has social and economic and and other factors that obviously don't have to affect us as a pure play pharmaceutical science company. What has changed over the years, though, is an acceptance that modification of the endocannabinoid system, and we, as I say, have three ways we can modify that, is a really exciting area, because biologically, one, the cannabinoid system is expressed widely throughout the body. So that makes it very attractive. There's a lot of diseases that then could potentially affect. It's also a system which we know comes into play more when the body is stressed. That could be inflammatory stress, cancer. It could be painful responses. That's when the endocannabinoid system sort of picks up pace, and obviously, therefore, that gives you a nice target to affect something which is only sort of in full biological mode when the body's sort of needing some help. And finally, the data coming in from preclinically in animal studies and clinically, keeps reassuring us, our investors and people who believe in the endocannabinoid system, that these drugs really can play a really crucial part in treating unmet medical conditions. So a great example of that was recently GW Pharmaceuticals, who have now been acquired by Jazz. They had their CBD product, Epidiolex, approved in two very rare forms of childhood epilepsy. And we are talking about sort of game changer type status. These children were treated with every known anti-epileptic drug, both licensed and unlicensed, because they were so severe. And they were having seizures 10 to, many more than hundreds of seizures a day. And introduction of CBD as a medicine under their brand name of Epidiolex, completely reversed that, which is why the product was approved, without any trouble by the FDA and the EMEA within Europe. So that medicine's now being used. And there have been medicines before, but they've tended to play in sort of smaller places and perhaps didn't have as much robust clinical evidence behind them. And clearly, because we're a biotech and are using classical regulatory approved approaches to developing drugs, we're putting our molecules within our portfolio through the most rigorous and widely accepted tests of safety and efficacy and risk and benefit. So if they end up as medicines, both doctors, patients, carers will all know that the drug has passed muster, if you wish, and shown that it's the right drug to be using in that indication in the patients that it's indicated for.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think that's a great example, the GW Jazz one as well. And I guess that's a good segue into some of the therapeutic areas that Artelo are focused on, and potential unmet need that you might be able to help serve with your particular cannabinoid platform. Could you talk to us a little bit about some of those therapeutic areas and indications, if you like, that you're primarily focused on, and maybe introduce to us as to why current treatment options may not be optimal, and what you're hoping to see, or what you may have seen already from the research that you've got involved in to date?
Fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. I'll walk you through the portfolio in that sort of, with that oversight ready at hand. So two of them are quite easy to actually explain, because particularly in terms of what therapies are available, because in two areas, the true test of unmet need is there are no licensed medicines. So starting from the top, if you wish, our lead program, which is in the clinic in a phase 1b, phase 2 study in patients with cancer anorexia, is looking to treat the devastating consequences of having cancer and then rapidly losing weight. We know that this occurs it depends on the cancer, it depends on how, the methodology used, but somewhere between 50 and 80% of cancer patients will suffer cancer anorexia, which is defined as loss of appetite and a reduction in body weight, usually above 5%. And for this particular condition, it really matters because, one, the patient's quality of life is very much determined by some of those factors. Appetite, we all know the pleasure we take in eating. Body weight, it's a visual thing. It's a visual thing for ourselves, and it's a visual thing for our carers around us. It's a pseudo measure of health status. And that can be, particularly worrying and troublesome for patients who, I'm sure we've all seen them. Some of them can become quite skeletized, if you wish, when the cancer really kicks in. More importantly, beyond that, the cancer, the status of your weight with cancer is often a very good predictor of your morbidity and mortality with the cancer. So clearly, a key objective of us understanding is if we can reverse that weight loss, put weight back onto patients, are they, do their survival times increase? Do their morbidity with the cancer, is that reduced? And if you take that all the way through, potentially some cancer patients come off chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and surgery because at that point, they're so frail and weak, the treating oncologist does not want to take them into any more treatments that will adversely affect their quality of life and ability to cope. The first rule of being a doctor is do no harm. And you can see a situation where if our treatment with ART 2713 can put that weight back on, restore quality of life, restore measures of health that we all recognize, then maybe that patient would be eligible for further treatment down classic pathways there. So that's the lead compound. Put in background, there are no approved therapeutic options in the Western world for the treatment of cancer, anorexia. And there are therapies that are used, sometimes steroids. There are sometimes actually straight up cannabis can be used, but it's not very effective because of the way it works versus our lead drug. So you can imagine bringing that to the market. You've got 50 to 80% of patients who may require that therapy. In the worst case, it will improve quality of life and put weight on, and that would obviously be associated with how the patient and the carers feel. Living well with cancer is a vision that we sort of use throughout the company with a number of our programs. But then take that into those other areas I explained of whether that can improve survival or offer other opportunities for treatment options that weren't on the table. And I think we've got a very exciting product profile there. Moving to our next portfolio project, ART 2612. This drug is an inhibitor of a protein in the body called fatty acid binding protein that basically lives inside your cells, and its job is to work as the taxi or the bus, picking up fatty molecules from the outside of the cell that don't like to be out in the aqueous water environment, chaperoning them, sort of giving them a big hug, bringing them inside the cell, and then transporting those fatty acids to wherever they need to be within the cell. That could be the mitochondria, the nucleus, and other biological areas where they can either be used for signaling, used for fuel, as in their for creating energy, or broken down. And what we know with our inhibitor is that we can selectively inhibit those fatty acid binding proteins, particularly an isoform 5, which is particularly linked with endocannabinoid transfer. And we can stop it from carrying fatty acids, which means there's more fatty acids outside the cell. And in the case of endocannabinoids, they go off and do what we sort of know and love from cannabis medicines. They activate CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors and do all of that. But they sort of do it naturally because it's using the endogenous ligands, not something that we've had to sort of guess at what the concentration should be and all the rest of it. And internally, instead of these fatty acids going off and signaling in the nucleus to perhaps in a cancerous situation, like we know, create pro-oncogenic downstream signaling, VEGF, EGRF, etc., that we know are linked with cancer. We've got good evidence that our inhibition of FABP5 is a good approach to anti-proliferation and anti-migration of cancer cells. So we can affect the cell that way by actually using the body's own lipids and endocannabinoids, but just sort of tickling and switching off one of the carrier proteins and just making more available outside the cell, and I guess less available inside the cell. And that balance, we think, is very useful in cancer. And it's also useful in actually where our lead indication is at the moment, which is in a disease called, or a indication called chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy. So again, this is cancer patients taking certain types of chemotherapy, very common chemotherapy, platinum-based agents, taxanes. These are breast, lung, colorectal, ovarian, you name it. These cancers tend to get them, and some others as well, Velcade for multiple myeloma and vincristine. And what these drugs do is they're very good at killing cancer cells, but they're also very good at killing other cells in the body that you don't want them to hurt. We all know the side effects of chemotherapy: nausea, vomiting, hair loss, low white blood cells, etc. Well, there's another thing which is called peripheral neuropathy that occurs particularly with those agents. And what happens here is the patient can develop, usually within the limbs and the hands and the feet, can be anything from sort of gentle pins and needles through to excruciating hypersensitivity, which you can't touch anything. Wearing normal shoes is just a no-go. It's very painful. And ultimately, it's a very debilitating effect in its own right for quality of life for the patients. But again, similar to our lead program, 2713, if patients develop chemo-induced peripheral neuropathy, our little code name for that or abbreviation is SIPN, by the way. So if you hear me talk about SIPN, it's the same thing. Again, it forces the treating oncologists to potentially lower the dose of the chemo, introduce dosing holidays within the treatment regime, or even stop the chemotherapy. So again, hopefully you can see the read through there is if we can prevent and treat chemo-induced peripheral neuropathy, then not only are we taking away a very painful, uncomfortable, and debilitating symptom for patients who already have enough to cope with their cancer, but equally it might mean that we don't have to withdraw, reduce the dose, and ultimately offer optimized chemotherapy treatment for patients with cancer, which the ultimate end game, of course, is to kill the cancer and let the patients live longer and get on with their lives. And our final program is ART 1211. And what we've done there is we've recognized that the plant produces a beautiful medicine called CBD. So biologically, CBD, I think most of your listeners will have heard or come across CBD. CBD is cannabidiol. Certainly here in the UK, it's the one that you can buy at Holland and Barrett and Boots Pharmacy and Sainsbury's and online and garages, and it's touted as a wonder drug that can cure all. I mean, that's based on actually a lot of clinical evidence that it has some very nice effects, both preclinically and clinically, in a lot of disease states. Now, those people using over-the-counter CBD, I'm not really going to go there other than to say that the doses they use in, and sometimes the quality of that medicine and the actual CBD itself is probably not optimal for what they're hoping to get out of it. And one of the reasons it's not optimal is because CBD is a very fatty molecule. We all know that fats and waters don't mix, but fat and water has to mix if you're going to take something orally, and it mixes in your stomach and hopes to get across the gastrointestinal lining and ultimately end up in your blood where it goes to do the work. So we didn't want to sort of change what CBD can do, because we big believers in CBD can do an awful lot of interesting and valuable things in the medical space. but we wanted to optimize it. So how did we do that? We formed what we call a co-crystal of CBD. So that is crystallizing out CBD, which if you've ever worked with it in a solid state, it can be a waxy substance. It's not really crystalline. It can be amorphous as well. Sorry, it can have polymorphism, which means it exists in different states. Very low melting point, not a great substance to work with from a pharmaceutical perspective. And what we've done by combining it with TMP, which is what we call a coformer, tetramethylperazine, is that we've added a sort of spacer unit into the crystal structure. And I use Lego as my analogy here. It's like a red brick and a yellow brick and a red brick and a yellow brick. And by doing that, we form a nice crystalline lattice. We raise the melting point, makes it easier to handle and try and use. Using white crystalline powders is always easier than using waxy, oily substances. And what we hope to have done by that is by spreading the CBD out, even though it's a waxy lipid substance, is that we've allowed the water, when it gets into the body, easier ingress into that crystal structure, so that the CBD is more easily solubilized. And if it's more easily solubilized, then it can obviously have a chance to get across the gastrointestinal lining and in. Where we believe substances like that, our co-crystal has a really good opportunity is in disease states like PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. Why that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. CBD from the plants doesn't have intellectual property around it. So the route chosen by GW and now Jazz has been to develop CBD in orphan indications. And we know that developing in an orphan indication, you get additional enhanced protections given to you by the regulatory agency where no one's able to cross-reference your data. So for them, it's a way of building intellectual property into, but orphan drugs and orphan conditions, whilst incredibly important to treat, are not, just by limiting yourself there, you're not able to affect non-orphan conditions like PTSD. The other thing is that GW and many other pharmaceutical companies experimenting with CBD have taken the only approach really available to them, which is to pre-solubilize that crystal. So it comes in an oral solution. In fact, I'd bet that 90% plus of your listeners who have used CBD, it's come in an oil. It's come in, peanut oil, olive oil, MCT. And that's because, as I've just explained, the crystal doesn't dissolve very well. So you have to pre-dissolve it to help it on its way. Now, that's okay. A lot of people tolerate that, but it's not optimal. We're all used to taking a tablet or a capsule if that's available to us. And so again, for conditions like PTSD, where I would just call it it's a debilitating condition, but it's a sort of normal condition. I don't think people necessarily want to get out a bottle of oil and squirt quite large quantities of oil under their tongue and, hold it there for 2 minutes before swallowing on a full stomach, because CBD is very unpredictable with its bioavailability if you take on an empty stomach. And what we think we've done with the crystal is built in IP, so we can develop it in non-orphan indications and protect our investment, protect our investors' investment, and B, giving it that chance to exist in a capsule or tablet that you don't need to pre-solubilize it. That gets done because of the inherent crystal structure. So I hope that was probably not a whistle-stop tour. It's probably a bit more in depth than you were perhaps imagining, but that's our three programs within Artelo.
No, that was an amazing summary of the three related but quite different programs by the sounds of things. And can we zoom in a little bit on your more advanced program looking at cancer anorexia? I think that one's in the clinic, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Could you maybe talk to us a little bit about any specifics around trial design when you're looking at this particular therapeutic area and method of treatment?
Sure.
And anything interesting about clinical trials in this space?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think one of the things I perhaps didn't cover in my whistle-stop tour was the mechanism of action of ART 2713 and where it came from. So it was originally developed by AstraZeneca, this drug, as an analgesic agent. And in their early trials, it didn't give the analgesic performance that they were looking for. So they parked that program, and we subsequently have been able to license it, add additional intellectual property into it through a formulation approach we've chosen, which actually is a quite tricky product to formulate. AZ had just used it in a oral solution, but we've overcome that and got some quite robust IP around that. And what it is it's a CB1, CB2 agonist. So if people know what the plant does, this is sort of the modern medicinal chemist's version of THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. Well, that's the stuff in cannabis that makes you feel high. So what did the medicinal chemists do first and foremost? They peripherally restricted it. So it doesn't go into the brain as much as it hangs around in the body. And that, of course, reduces all of those CNS side effects. We've seen that from the original work done by AstraZeneca, where only at the sort of very highest doses we're not trialing, did you sort of see the CNS side effects start to creep through. The other thing we've done is taken something which, if we're dealing with THC, is not very good at being orally dosed. It's not got very good pharmacokinetics and needs to be dosed a couple of times a day. And we've taken that into a very easy, predictable, once daily formulation. Take it in the morning or in the evening, whenever we land on where the best time to take that is. And that's it done, one capsule. So the trial we designed was actually a bit of a hybrid trial because, as I say, AstraZeneca had already done 5 clinical studies on the substance already, but it was all in healthy volunteers or translational sort of pain model work within the clinic. And rightly so, the regulators said, before you trial this in cancer patients who they felt were more vulnerable, you need to go back and reestablish what your dose range is, reestablish safety, and make sure nothing's going on in a cancer patient that you didn't see in a healthy volunteer. And that's really the basis of the dual phase 1B, phase 2 design with what we call CARES, which is the Cancer Appetite Recovery Study. It's being conducted in 6 sites within the UK and Ireland. We're based in the UK, our R&D centre. And there are also, because of the way the NHS is structured and the fact that we can tap into a very good palliative care and hospice network system, which is required for our first study because we've had to limit patients that are on variable or new therapies for their cancer, because that was a variable too much that we wanted to avoid. So we've gone for patients who are not currently receiving cancer chemotherapy. And of course, for that, a lot of them are at the end of their cancer treatment pathways. Not in all cases, because we can allow certain treatments to stay on it. But the CARES study is a dose ascending phase 1, but going out over a lot more longer than you'd expect for a phase 1, because we had toxicology cover for out to 3 months. Okay. We treat patients for a month. We take some weight and other measures at that point, quality of life, safety, of course, because that's what the phase 1's all about, pharmacokinetics. And at 1 month, we can make a decision as to whether to escalate the dose up the range. But those patients that want to and are doing well on the treatments, and that was in most cases, most of them, carry on for 3 months. So we're building out 3 months worth of data on cohorts of 6 patients at the different dose levels. So we've got 4 doses under evaluation, and actually we've just issued a press release that we've successfully completed the first 3 cohorts, which is where we thought we might need to sort of stop as safety side effects crept in. But unusually and surprisingly, it was great that the regulators asked to go back and assess this safety profile in patients. because we're not seeing actually even the same safety profile that AZ looked at in healthy volunteers. It's looking cleaner, which is great, because that's then allowed us to go up to our sort of optional dose of 650 micrograms. And obviously same things happen there. And at the end of the 1 month period with this 650 microgram cohort, we're going to look at all of the data and choose the dose that we wish to take into the phase 2, which is a randomized placebo control aspect where patients will receive the chosen phase 2 dose or placebo. It will be a period of assessment over 3 months. We don't need to go back to the regulators. The whole protocol's been approved, so we can move rapidly into phase 2. And we're making all the same measurements of weight, appetite scores, pain scores, quality of life scores, lean body mass, all the things that you'd expect from an early sort of proof of concept study. But we're also building in an activity monitor for that part. And the reason we're doing that is because, at least from some of our key opinion leaders that we're looking at, they believe that an increased drive in appetite, an increased weight, i.e., calories in the system, energy to burn, will actually improve patients' mobility and movement. Now, we're not talking about going out and moving, running marathons or even some of the more sort of objective measures that can sometimes be used in clinical trials, like stair climbs and grip strength. We're not really looking for that, because at this point, we don't have that evidence, if you wish, to say we're going to alter that. But what we do think is that happier, hungrier people with not down to their sort of lowest weight, bit of weight on, are going to feel like getting out of bed more and joining the family at the dinner table more, and maybe popping down to the shops, or if we're lucky, getting to a restaurant. And what we've worked hard with is these movement devices to understand that we can check and sort of qualify and quantify what people's changes in movement are through that period. And obviously we hope that the improvements made both on an individual patient level, so start a trial to end a trial, can be measured, but also we can spot differences between the active treatment group and the placebo arm.
Amazing. And you feel free to pass on this question if you can't talk about it for confidentiality reasons, but can you talk a little bit about some of the technology that you're embracing when it comes to activity tracking and things like that? This is really interesting, because I think your listeners will find this interesting. I probably won't mention the brand we're using, just sure. I'm not sure of our relationship there. But actually, the mantra for this, ultimately, we went everywhere with this. We went everywhere. There's so many devices you can look at, worn in different ways with different algorithms and different. But our mantra became keep it simple, stupid. Yes. And that's for a whole host of reasons. One, from the trial center perspective, they're busy enough. The working clinical trial nurses and clinical trial units don't want anything that's super complex. So we went for really simple design, long battery life, no Wi-Fi connections. It's they're coming in for enough assessments, just hardwired into the computer. It's certified and validated by the agencies, so we don't have any trouble doing that. For the patient perspective, it's small, discreet. The straps can be changed. It can be worn wrist, anklet, even waistband if needed. So we've been able to tap into all of the various. How does it work best for you? Waterproof. As I say, they don't have to go home and they don't have to have a phone or an app carried around with them. It's just there on the watch. And I've worn one for a month, as have quite a few of the project team, to just give it a real life testing. It was quite interesting. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute, but we swapped watches halfway through just to see if the algorithms could detect, and they could. And I was told that I need more sleep because brilliant.
But no, so for the patient, it's simple. And the other thing we were really keen on, we obviously, there's fantastic Fitbits, Apple Watches, that whole technology, nothing wrong with it. But of course, what people like about it is that it's constantly flashing and beeping at you to do more and work harder. And have you thought about this? And we didn't want any of that. We're putting this down. The hypothesis is that the drug will make you feel hungrier, eat more, put on weight, and your body will choose to do a bit more behind the scenes because of that. And finally, there are some nice bits of software that once it's downloaded at the clinical study site, we get access to that data, and the algorithms can detect, everything from sleep, heavy activity, light activity, sedentary behavior, and it sort of does that all automatically, and you can have a million different outputs from that.
Awesome. Great. And will this data support one of the key endpoints, or is it more exploratory?
Exploratory. It is in there as a secondary endpoint, but exploratory in the way that what we've got to do, because this is, as I say, there's no licensed or approved medicines, so we can't follow anyone else's pathway or approach to doing this. We've worked obviously with the regulators so far to get their views about what's important for them, and linking up appetite with true improvements in the patient's health status. And we think that movement is an important part of that. So what we're going to be able to do at the end of it is look at the entirety of the data. I mean, I feel a bit sorry for some of these patients on this trial, because there's a lot of questionnaires at the moment, because we're trying to baseline what's the right questionnaire that can capture the right amount of information in the shortest amount of time. And as you know, with the early trials, you have to go out there and spread the net a bit wider than you will do. And then, of course, for subsequent phase 3s, which is where we think we could go to as our next trials, because of the database we've already established on the product, and we can go out there. I should have mentioned, of course, because I haven't, there's so much to cover in an unstructured interview like this or discussion. But we have a lot of confidence this drug will do what we hope, because in AstraZeneca's trial, although they didn't note any analgesic behavior of the compound particularly that allowed them or gave them confidence to carry on, patients in a very dose responsive manner put on weight over 12 days, and quite a lot of weight in some cases. It seems to be, at least in the healthy volunteer population, a very potent pro-weight gain drug. Some people have even questioned, well, how does that work? Because isn't the appetite center all in the brain? And you've just said it's peripherally restricted. But actually what we know is the body's full of cannabinoid receptors, as in the peripheral body. And by targeting and triggering them, actually you let them do the work back to the brain. So through either, afferent nerves going back up to the brain, or release of hormones and endocrine systems from the GI tract, they will all signal back. They'll work locally and make that tissue do better things for your metabolism and weight gain status, but they also sort of send their signals back up to the brain and trigger appetite as well. So
it's fascinating. Really interesting. What about the whole quality of life assessments? I think you touched upon that before. How can you remove the burden of these pretty sick patients when it comes to collecting those types of endpoints and make it less of a chore? And in my mind's eye, moving more towards these activity trackers has to be more convenient for a patient and less subjective, perhaps, as well.
Absolutely. And we've done quite a lot of work on this with both the trial centers and just our backgrounds, have worked on similar trials, etc. So I think one of the things that seems to, the go-to place to make it easier for patients is, put it on an app. And, well, average age, don't quote me on this as such, but average age of our patients that I've seen coming through so far is at least 60 plus, it's sort of that type of age group. Not all of them are smartphone savvy. Not all of them. I mean, I've had personal experience of this myself. I've had an app, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to use it when you're meant to use it. And so we've largely stayed with paper-based designs because, as I say, at this stage, the patients are coming into the clinic anyway fairly frequently for various different assessments. And as I say, we've spread the net wide. Some very simple ones like appetite score. Sort of basically, do you have an appetite, and just get into the bottom of that. Others are just much more related to all the symptoms and the likes you could expect. And the reason we've done that actually is because cannabinoids, one of the other licensed cannabinoids is called nabilone. And nabalone's used in chemo-induced nausea and vomiting. So cannabinoids are known to affect nausea and vomiting centers. Now, we're not going after that, but we'd like to have a little look at it within a score just to see if we can see any discernible changes. Cannabinoids, this compound, was originally designed as an analgesic, both in its own right and potentially in combination with opiates. So we've got like an opiate diary in there that, again, we'll try to capture whether we are getting that effect, which would be great sort of additional value, if you wish, out the drug, but may not, but we're looking for all these different things. But you're right, when it comes to the larger trials where patients, if you wish, will be put on a drug, a dose that's known, and pretty much go off, and 3 months later come back and hopefully, with their data, then clearly we are looking at all options to make that process as streamlined, simple, and painless for both the clinical teams, ourselves, and the patients, most importantly.
Got it. And just to change direction slightly, do you encompass any headwinds when it comes to working with cannabinoids, and then the regulatory and other potential headwinds of running clinical trials that involve a substance, for want of a better term, like cannabis?
We have done. We haven't at the actual health regulators. So MHRA, for instance, FDA, Health Canada, all regulators we've spoken to, they just treat it like any other IMPD or IND. You've got to go in with your package. They are, of course, interested in abuse liability and potential, but that's standard for drugs that can affect the CNS system. So we're nothing special, really. We just go in with the preclinical and the clinical evidence we've captured so far and make a case. Again, it's another assessment the patients are undergoing in our CARES trial, just qualifying that in cancer patients. So they treat us well. CT, you get clinical trials authorization, nothing particularly special there. Where it sort of has been challenging for us, although we've overcome that challenge now, was with some of the agencies responsible for diversion and illicit use of drugs. So in the UK, that would be the Home Office, in the US, DEA. Mm-hmm. Now, there are some authorities, like in Canada and in Ireland, where actually the medical regulator does the control of the controlled substances. So they've been quite interesting to work with because they can see it holistically at a medical clinical trials level, and then have their sort of their more sort of policing hat on for diversion and illicit use. But it all comes together in one pot. In the US, we've not had to work much with the DEA yet because we've kept the trials in primarily in Europe. So we've got Ireland, UK, and we have approval in Norway.
Okay.
Ready to go for the stage 2 or phase 2 part of CARES. So originally our drug, because of Home Office classification rules at the time, was a Schedule 1 controlled drugs. That put it into the same category as LSD and ecstasy and psilocybin from magic mushrooms, all drugs and medicines we've heard of in different ways. But clearly it was a bit of an irony because you weren't going to get high off our drug. It was been specifically designed not to. Yeah. But through careful discussions and navigation with the Home Office, in the end, we were able to make that case to them and bring forward exactly how our drug worked. And actually we ended up in a great situation where it's no longer scheduled at all. So it's not a controlled drug in the UK, which is where I think it absolutely should be. There's no abuse and no diversion risk as I see from this drug. It's just not where you'd go if you wanted to make a party drug or a high. So yes, it caused some pain and some reductions in speed and efficiency at the beginning because we were Scheduled 1 and operating under Schedule 1 for any of your viewers who've had to do it is onerous. Equally, there was nothing the MHRA or the Department of Health and Social Care could do to influence the Home Office. They are two separate silos.
Yeah.
So even though our sort of clinical trial, application was approved, they were still going around and making it mandatory that they would have to inspect the hospital, enhanced DBS checks on hospital doctors, pharmacists handling the drug. So on one hand, they had a controlled drugs cabinet that contained diamorphine, cocaine, gabapentin, but then in order to have another safe with our drug locked inside, they needed to go through a whole series of Home Office required checks. And you could see the craziness there, but thankfully that's all gone now. And we would obviously now have a bit of a pathway forward as well with other agencies that we might want to talk to, like the US, where we'll have to involve both FDA and DEA to get their understanding of where the molecule falls.
Got it. And do either yourself or Artelo have any perspective on other controlled drugs and their use in clinical research?
There's a sort of little club of us of people developing drugs in that space. You get to know other people and their risks. So yeah, I mean, I think it would be great if let's say here in the UK as a sort of we've just come out of Europe, we have our own regulatory destiny to plan for and execute on. And we've got a very good system where the NHS is aligned with the NIHR. So we've got the MHRA, a very world-renowned regulatory authority. And I've made the case through representation through different bodies that really, if we want to make the UK, for instance, a hub of R&D clinical excellence for some of these psychedelics, then there needs to be a sort of more open approach to them, and they should be treated as a IMPD first and a controlled drug second. And the irony is, of course, if you go through the process to get a clinical trial authorization and you're doing all your drug manufacturing under GMP, both substance and drug product, then actually you've already got amazingly high levels of control in that process. And to me, it's a sort of a little bit of an educational exercise to perhaps bring in the UK's case, the Home Office into that discussion and give them the reassurance that everyone involved is bona fide, trusted, status, if you wish, trusted partner status. And from that, a lot of the onerous tasks of perhaps double checking and triple checking doctors' credentials, working in an NHS hospital already dispensing controlled drugs, perhaps needs to go away. Perhaps they don't need to go and inspect, one of the key hospitals in London for its policy on controlled drugs. You'd perhaps just hope that they already had a fantastic one in place. And really, in a way, what you could do is sort of offshoot some of that responsibility that the Home Office currently has to have, because that's how the law's drafted, over to someone like the MHRA. And they only need to tap into the Home Office if they've got any risks or things they need to discuss about. But pretty much the MHRA rubber stamps you, whatever drug substance you're handling, including controlled drugs. Now, that would be through the clinical trials process. Obviously, at the end of the clinical trials process, when you go for a marketing authorization or an NDA in the US, then clearly at some point it'll have to go back into a more formal procedure where it may need to be a controlled drug. I mean, I don't think Art 2713 does, but there may be drugs where, psilocybin, for instance, it may make you hallucinate at certain doses, and therefore it's always going to be a diversion risk, and that might need that. But that would be after the clinical trial process is finished, because as we've discussed today, as you're obviously aware from previous interviews and things you've looked at, these drugs or these medicines, have a huge amount of potential if researched and developed in the right way. And there's already enough barriers and costs and resource requirements to do a clinical trial. You don't need extra ones thrown in simply because, at some point it's been used, not in the intended way. It will be trialed in a clinical trial.
Yeah. And almost, to the point of do no harm. We could be doing harm potentially by not exploring these psychedelics and other substances.
Absolutely, totally convinced of that. Both, including outside of the Artelo spot. Artelo is going to make this. If we get to the end of our journey, Artelo is going to make this incredibly simple for doctors, patients, carers, because they're not going to even know it's an endocannabinoid modifying drug. It's just going to be another drug, brand name. Use this dose. Here's the safety profile. Here's what it does. And they'll just know it like any other drug. But putting that to one side, in the near term, there are patients that we know get benefit from using cannabis-based medicinal products here in the UK and wider afield. And, it's, as much as some of the things have opened up, it's still a very grey area for them. Quality of products, availability, private pay versus NHS, and I think that still needs addressing at a holistic level, because you've got situations where patients are having to use black market obtained cannabis medicines to treat their medical condition. And even if they went in and explained, even if they came from the highest credible background you can think of, the NHS doctor would say, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do, I can't prescribe it.
Yeah.
You've got to go private on that, or possibly I can't even send you down that route. So I think that's an imbalance in the healthcare system that just needs addressing. And again, with another hat that I wear, where I'm still a pharmacy lead for the Centre for Medicinal Cannabis, which is a UK-based, patient advocacy and grower advocacy group that works with the government quite high level. Recently worked with Professor Christopher Hodges on some of these regulatory changes that could be useful here in the UK. And so I start to see some of that inequality on a sort of real-time basis. And so, I'm an advocate for cannabis-based medicinal products being used where appropriate. And, we'll fight that cause on both, with both hats on, if you wish, developing great medicines here at Artelo Biosciences, but also making sure in the near term suitable patients can access suitable cannabis-based medicines while they wait for our R&D machine to turn these out into medicines at the end of the day.
Amazing. And as we start to draw this podcast episode to a close, Andy, we always ask our guests the same final question. And that question is, if there's one thing that you could change about our industry, what would that be?
I think in this case, because of my own personal circumstances, it would be what I've really just said, which is that a medicine being brought forward because of the value of the preclinical science or possibly clinical science should be treated as a medicine under development, regardless of its potential abuse liability. I think the clinical trials environment is enough protection to make sure that this substance doesn't end up in the wrong hands, doesn't end up on the streets, doesn't end up with patients abusing it, because clinical trials don't allow for that anyway. So I think as an industry, we should treat all medicines, regardless of their origin, regardless of their history, as on an equal footing to run the clinical trial and get the evidence to state whether it is useful or it's not useful, or it has potential harms that need building in later on. And that's why I think I would raise that as a way unblock some great R&D if that could happen.
Well, fingers crossed that we can make some moves on that at some point in time. And I'm sure our listeners would have got a lot out of today's interview. If they do want to learn more either about yourself or Artelo Biosciences, what's the best place for them to come and connect with you?
Yeah, so we have a website which is www.artelobio.com. That contains everything on the portfolio we've just talked about. Also, because we are NASDAQ listed, it has all of our financial disclosures and SEC disclosures for anybody who may want to invest in a company. I'd encourage them to look at that. And for me personally, mine's quite simple, Andy, ANDY, at artelobio.com. And I'd happily field questions from anyone who's interested in this area, has any thoughts and ideas on anything we might have missed, or wants to speak about how do you get into this industry, etc. I'd be very happy to field their emails.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivanna Rosendal on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.